I also want to tell you briefly about being this week at the European Prayer Breakfast. So if we can get those slides up, IK. So you may have seen on Facebook that I was down in Brussels, the EU Parliament. It was a great trip, but I wanted to tell you a little bit because I've had some questions about what is the prayer breakfast and why, and are they really praying in Europe at the EU Parliament? And the answer is yes. The prayer breakfast is unabashedly about Jesus. And I was very happy to see this and find it. So this grew out of the National Prayer Breakfast in the United States of America. Now, that grew out, spoiler alert, of Norway. So this is kind of a fun connection, so I wanted to share it with you. So the people who are organizing these prayer breakfasts are very intentional about lifting up the name of Jesus. The origin of the National Prayer Breakfast is traced back to prayer groups with business and civic leaders in Seattle. And they were organized by Abraham Verida, who you can see there, in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, or later, he moved to Washington, D.C., and so he began to establish similar groups. He would get business leaders and local politicians together, and he would just pray with them. Well, there came a point where in 1953, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower was invited to attend one of these meetings by an invitation that came from congressmen and from Abraham and from Billy Graham. After this, it became the Presidential Prayer Breakfast. The name was changed in 1970 to the National Prayer Breakfast. Every American president since Dwight D. Eisenhower has participated in the annual event. Here's a picture of Obama's. It got a little bigger over time. 3,500 people gathering at the Hilton for the National Prayer Breakfast. Now again, I mentioned that Abraham started this. He was born October 7th, 1886 in Gloppen, Norway. That's in the north of Vestland. He received a ticket to the United States from a neighbor. Now this is fun to just see how God can use these things, because the neighbor had a ticket to go to the USA, but couldn't use it. So they had to stay, and they had the extra ticket, and they said, well, do you want it? So he got on the boat. He moves to America, gets to Montana. He found some basic menial work, and then he becomes an itinerant minister at the age of 20, so just helping preach at different churches in a 70-mile wide area, 110-kilometer area. Later, he studies at a seminary in Indiana. He marries the daughter of a Danish pastor in 1910, and then he becomes a Methodist minister. They assign him to Spokane, Washington, out in the northwest of the United States. And then he's in Portland, Oregon. Later in Seattle, he begins to organize these prayer groups. Just wants to focus on prayer. We need God's help to run a country. We need God's help to run a city. We need God's help to run a church, a family. He knows the need for prayer. And so he just begins to assemble people on the very small level there in Seattle. But over those years, it grew and it grew. And then he ends up going to Washington, D.C., and he starts what becomes known, as we said, the National Prayer Breakfast. It's now spread to over 100 countries and areas, which includes the European Prayer Breakfast that I attended this last week. It was later, after him, it was run by a guy named Doug Coe. His daughter was with us. She's quite old now, but she was with us in Brussels, as well as Richard C. Halverson. Richard Halverson was a reverend. He was a U.S. Senate chaplain. He has passed away long ago. His son, Chris Halverson, is in his 80s, and he's actually the one who invited me to come to the National Prayer Breakfast in February. That was before I got invited by someone else to the European Prayer Breakfast. So I've gotten these multiple invites from different places going, okay, God, what are you doing? Why do you want me there? So it was a very interesting experience to be there. But through Richard, who was running it, now Chris Halverson, his son, is helping to run it. So they've got it in over 100 countries. We had last month, there was the first ever Nordic-Baltic prayer meeting. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. Parliamentarians from those countries met together to pray. I was in a meeting with those same people this week, and they're now talking, and this is pretty neat, about having a Norwegian National Prayer Breakfast. So something that was started by a Norwegian has now gone around the world, and now there's members of parliament here. Some of you may know the name Lars Risa. He was there with us in Brussels. they're saying, hey, let's start having the same thing in Norway. Let's gather those who would like to pray. Let's those who want to follow the teachings of Jesus. They're not big on focusing on, they don't talk about denominations or even religion. They just talk about Jesus. But they do talk very clearly about Jesus. They pray in his name and they give him glory. And it's happening in parliaments all over the world. So it's very exciting and it has been life-changing. It's been very interesting to hear some of the stories of some of the world leaders, and some of which can't be shared totally publicly, but how their lives have been changed because they've come in contact with Jesus and people who love Jesus. And then outside of the formal setting, there's a lot of meetings that happen on the side. And there are leaders in some very difficult countries who are now following Jesus. At some point in a non-streaming setting, I can tell you some inspiring stories about that. So it was very exciting to be there and be a part of it. I do look forward to being at the National Prayer Breakfast in D.C. February 1st or 2nd, the first Thursday in February, and just getting a chance to see what God is doing through this really incredible ministry that reaches out to the top leaders in the world and glorifies the name of Jesus. So thank you for your prayers and for your support in that. Now we're going to move on to lighting the candle of joy today. But first we'll dim the lights and we'll watch our Advent video on joy.